Billy Meier, 750th contact, Saturday, August the 22nd, 2020. Over 32 million cases, 1 million deaths by end of September. Mermaids, Minotaurs, time travel, aging and Jack the Ripper. 750th contact, Saturday, August the 22nd, 2020. 00.17H. A wealth of information for our scientists, if they can understand it. This is an unofficial, unauthorized translation and may contain errors. It will be replaced by the official, approved translation when available.
Ah, there you are. Greetings and welcome, my friend.
Greetings to you too, Eduard, dear friend. It simply leaves me no peace, what that part of the responsible Irish specialists, what they want to be, but are not, is spreading with big and important words concerning the corona disease as important information, although they have only little knowledge and do not know the real facts of the whole thing. This, while the other part, which really tries to get the whole facts and connections and recognizes and correctly assesses them, as well as the precarious situation, does not want to be heard, or its findings and insights are not taken seriously. This is not only the case in the medical, virological, epidemiological and other disease-experienced professional circles, but also in the heads of state and authorities and health organizations, etc., where the word is spoken by those who, in their ignorance and lack of knowledge, addictedly emphasize themselves. This while those who have gained good knowledge and expertise are not listened to, or they are imposed silence and forbidden to speak out their expertise. It is simply alarming how unreasonable many earthly people are, because one of my foresights reveals more and more disaster that will be conjured up in the coming times by the ignorance and unreasonableness of about a quarter of the earthly humanity. Although this quarter corresponds to a minority of the entire mass of the earthly overpopulation, this minority is fully prepared to use violence, which is already evident in the United States and will soon be evident in Europe as well. The corona pandemic and the conspiracy theories arising from it, as well as the enactment of necessary protective measures against the epidemic, are already being used as justification for right-wing demonstrations and acts of violence in a few days. Right-wing extremists, less than rich citizens greater than, and conspiracy theorists will come together and incite the large masses of the unpermitted and stupid of those participating in demonstrations and seduce them into shameful acts.
It will probably not be possible to change this if you say that you already know this from a future view. But even that part of the virologists is no better, who pretend to be well, but do not recognize what is really going on.
Many virologists, medical professionals, epidemiologists, etc. are incapable of recognizing that the corona disease virus is constantly changing in its mode of action, as well as that it is beginning to spread in a new variation to younger ages under 40 and to adolescents and children, and already has various characteristics that are still absolutely unknown to all terrestrial corona researchers. As I already told you on August the 5th, the number of people infected with corona disease will exceed 27 million by the end of this month, but due to a miscalculation, this will not be officially known until 7 days later. However, by the end of September next month, the number of people infected with corona will increase much further and officially exceed 32 million, while the number of fatalities will also increase dramatically and will also quickly and far exceed the first million before the end of September next month. So I repeat that it will now be, as I have said, that the corona disease death toll will increase in a few weeks to such an extent that worldwide, in just a few weeks, a number of over 1 million victims will have been reached, which will be by the end of the following month of September. And as I also explained earlier, the corona epidemic is now claiming tens of thousands of infected people and deaths in all the countries of Europe, but especially India, Brazil and all other countries of the world are increasingly affected. This, because now the spreading wave is rising to its full size, spread and strength worldwide, still as a first wave, although it is still not understood that it is not a second wave, which can be pending at a later time. But from now on, the recklessness of those responsible for the state will take revenge, who on the one hand ordered a halfway effective lockdown and then irresponsibly lifted it again after a largely useless execution due to commercial pressure, economic desire, and various other shortcomings, as well as due to population quarrels. What has happened so far all over the world regarding the corona epidemic was only the beginning of the whole thing, because now the corona wave, which already started last year, is really rolling off and rises to its peak and will continue to roll until it has largely run its course. But this will not be the final end, because at least its danger will continue to exist. Even countries where it is assumed that they have survived the worst will again be affected by the epidemic, which will again lead to many deaths. In addition, even after it has subsided, and even years and decades later, the disease can continue to claim infected persons and fatalities, on the one hand directly by the corona disease, which can break out again and again, even in convalesced corona patients, but on the other hand also by other diseases, which can cause completely different corona-induced diseases as a result of corona influences. All this, as elsewhere in the future, also women who have recovered from the corona disease can experience serious health problems and birth impairments during pregnancy. According to our research findings, under certain circumstances, genetically inheritable damage and changes are to be feared, as well as impairments of neurologic factors and of the consciousness of the patient. The brain, in general the organs and their function, as well as the coordinative abilities RISP. The general ability to organize different single tasks and activities in a complex field of activity and to cope with them in such a way that they fit together in a meaningful and purposeful way, can be evaluated and applied in a coordinated way. However, it will take a long time for the medical sciences of terrestrial mankind to recognize, grasp and understand all these facts, and not only months and years, but possibly many decades, or even into the time of the next centuries. In total, the number of corona epidemics and corona deaths will exceed all previous figures within the next few weeks. And still, in spite of contrary claims of unreliable, in their ignorance with the untruth and with unrealistic explanations of wanting to make themselves big less than experts greater than, the beginning wave RISP. The first wave of the corona epidemic is still predominant, which is now worldwide only in full strength, up, down and up again, spreading and swelling down again, but this will last for a long time. This means, however, that even after the peak the danger of the corona epidemic will not be averted, because even after the epidemic has subsided it will remain active and will claim many more infected persons and victims over time, as I have fathomed in advance. Consequently, all necessary preventive and protective measures should continue to be taken, against all other reckless state and official false declarations and measures, as well as against the dangerous lies and trivialization of the epidemic by stupid know-it-alls, as well as negating mindless and irrational people, who are not able to grasp the danger, as well as the intelligent conspiracy theorists and their believers, etc. The corona plague will therefore continue to claim, and for the time being strongly increasing, very many and soon over 1 million human lives, as a result of the stupidity, unreasonableness and incapacity of the stupid and incapable as well as autocratic state officials, as well as that part of the equally stupid population that will not fit into the security precautions, as the herbal priest complained about in 1918 regarding the less than Spanish flu greater than, whom you met in 1944 together with my father's faith.
Source Wikipedia. Joan Kunzel, September 3, 1857 in Hindrespen near St. Gallen. Dagger January 9, 1945 in Zeisers, was a Swiss Catholic priest and publicist. Along with Sebastian Knipe, he is probably the best-known herbal priest and a promoter of alternative medicine and herbal medicine. Joan Kunzel's parents owned a farm. The father also worked as a trained gardener. After school in St. Gallen and the Einsiedeln Monastery, Kunzel studied theology and philosophy at the University of Leuven, Belgium, from 1877 and was ordained a priest at the St. Georgian Seminary, St. Gallen, in 1881. Afterwards he was active as a pastor in various parishes in eastern Switzerland, from 1896 to 1907 in Buchs in the Rhine Valley, until 1909 in Herisau and then until 1920 in Wangs near Sargans. During the Kulturkampf of 1884, Kunzel was active in the fight against the abolition of Catholic schools and institutions in Switzerland and Vorarlberg. In 1913 he promoted spa tourism in Wangs, near Bad Ragaz, and founded a herb market. Since it was attributed to his efforts that in 1918, when the Spanish flu raged worldwide, not a single person in the community died, he was granted honorary citizenship. Due to his sometimes dubious medical views, for example regarding the cure of diabetes, he was forcibly transferred by his bishop to Zeisers in Graubünden in 1920. In 1922, he passed an examination before a medical college in order to be allowed to run a poison-free medicinal herb practice. He also started a herbal trade and gave lectures on the use of herbal medicine. The Krauter Pfarrer Kunzel AG was founded in 1939. In 1954 it moved to Minusio, near Locarno, and was converted into a foundation in 1980. Kunzel was the editor of popular folk calendars, the monthly magazine Salvia for poison-free herbal medicine, author of the Grosse Krauter Heilbuch, 1944, later edited and republished by Rudolf Fritz Weiss, among others, and many other publications. The book Krut und Ukrut was translated into several languages after its first publication in 1911 and is still being published today. In Zeisers he worked successfully as an entrepreneur and publicist until the end of his life, but always in the service of the Catholic Church. In Wangs you can walk along the Pfarrer Kunzel Wedge, which was built and inscribed by the Pfarrer Kunzel of Rhin. There is also a grotto on the way, which Kunzel built with students and other residents of the community.
As for the corona epidemic and the behavior of government officials and sections of the population in this regard, since the beginning of the epidemic there has been an unparalleled irresponsibility of government officials and a large part of the population. As a result of their incapacity, which I must emphasize again and again, the powers that be have not taken the necessary measures from the very beginning of the epidemic to contain and prevent the pandemic. This is not only because they are unable to lead in every respect and have no ability to do so, but first of all because they are not able to assess and understand the situation in a consequent or logical way due to their lack of intelligence. But this lack of intelligence also prevents them from creating the ability to be foresighted and to be able to make the right decisions and to act rationally, so that they are completely unable to work out right behaviors in a crisis situation, as it is currently the case with the corona plague, to prescribe them and to enforce them and have them enforced by the whole population. So far, neither mandatory total activity blockades nor other correct and functioning safety measures have been issued for a necessary period of time, which could have nipped the epidemic in the bud within 2 to 3 months. Therefore, in the coming weeks and months, the entire population of many countries will continue to face disastrous times, because they will again be strongly affected by the disease. For this, however, clearly recognizably with the majority of the state responsible persons, as with the majority of the populations, the necessary intelligence was not sufficient. And this has remained so since the beginning of the corona epidemic up to the present day, and it will remain so as a result of the widely prevailing ignorance and unreasonableness of the majority of those responsible for the state and the majority of the populations acting in the same way. But in the time now to come this will bring much suffering as well as disaster to humanity on earth and claim many lives. Therefore the course of the corona epidemic will be protracted and the first wave will weaken only after a longer period of time. Only now will it reach its climax in a billowing up and down manner, which, however, will only be reached in a longer series of weeks and will claim deaths in excess of the first million. And this time the whole of Europe will be strongly affected by this, because now the stupidity of those responsible for the state will take revenge for recklessly opening the lockdown instead of carrying out the necessary deep blockade, which would have led not only to the containment but to the complete end of the epidemic. Other false assertions, which will come up again and again, that the expected second wave is already raging, correspond to a stupidity unlike any other, which leads to false hopes and to the fact that the security precautions against the epidemic are even more generally neglected, whereby as a result of this false assertion the still running first wave can spread rapidly further and will still claim many thousands of victims in the next months. The whole unreasonableness of the majority of the leaders and the population will not lead to the fact that everyone will become understanding, because on both sides all are equally irresponsible. The health of the people will therefore continue to be endangered by the epidemic, and under certain circumstances the whole thing can drag on for the next 18 to 24 months and will continue to claim many lives. There is already a risk that a permanent global pandemic could develop out of the whole, and continue for years, if all the necessary measures to end the worldwide epidemic are not taken.
Beautiful prospects. In Persia, more than 250 specialists have already died as a result of the coronavirus, just as the number of less than rich citizens greater than in Germany has increased enormously, without the security services knowing how many there really are. But regarding the corona epidemic, it is probably pointless to talk about it further, because reason is in short supply for the majority of those in power, and at least for 25–30% of the population. The sufferings are all those people who earnestly strive for the protective measures and behave correctly and responsibly, because their intelligence is up to date and they are therefore intelligent, whereas the intelligence is missing in all ricochets and believers of the conspiracy theorists, and consequently they are not able to think for themselves and are consequently addicted to stupidity. Stupidity is just that, after all, when a man does not think, and so does not think over a thing, etc., as a result of laziness of thought, faith, or defiance, etc., or when, for lack of intelligence, he is not able to do so. And, if a man lacks the intelligence to do that very thing which, as a result of misdesignation, ignorance, and traditional misnaming, was called intelligence, and is still used in the wrong way today, hops and malt are lost, because, consequently, understanding and reason cannot be used. This must be explained again and again. It is indeed necessary to explain this again and again and again, because the completely wrong terms, which have been used wrongly for centuries, express absolutely wrong factors, which have values other than those which would be right. This, as it is the case of the wrong term less than intelligence greater than, which effectively came up by a banal misunderstanding of an old Greek term, which in its origin meant as much as less than intellect memory greater than. I learned this already from my father's fath, who brought me to an ancient people in the Far East, but which in the course of time disintegrated and scattered in the Orient. In any case, I learned that this people knew a term in their language that expressed the cognitiveness of the human being, and with it the recognition and getting to know as well as the experience, and therefore also understanding, reason, knowledge and information processing. Though I still know and remember the contexts, I do not remember the names of the people, their language and their concepts, except that from one of the concepts of this people, which was transferred into ancient Greece, a new concept arose, which described the intellect, from which, as well as from another concept of another ancient language, the less than intellect, which is valuable in the German language, resulted. And this high-quality word term less than intellect greater than basically means the human intellect.
That's right, but is you're forgetting of names etc., the old Oriental Eastern and later dissolved and scattered people were one that.
Yes, it was, but to rewind it is certainly not appropriate. Unfortunately, I really forgot the names, which happens again and again, because I am getting older now and... Well, yes, that's natural, but that reminds me of a question I want to ask. But regarding cognition, I would like to say that it is a term that is used inconsistently, because it does not only refer to the mind and reason as well as to the knowledge and information processing of humans, but also to other things and systems that have neither directly nor indirectly anything to do with the intelligent. It is, however, fundamentally regrettable that from the correct term less than intelligentum greater than the wrong term less than intelligence greater than could ultimately penetrate and solidify in such a way that today, practically nobody knows anymore that less than intelligence greater than is only the intellect memory, which, however, does not mean the cognition and also not the intelligentum, as well as not the information processing of the human being. Therefore, the so-called IQ is erroneously and stupidly less than measured greater than with the intellect memory, with the term less than intelligence greater than, which we have already talked about before, precisely because less than intelligence greater than has nothing to do with the intelligence, and therefore nothing to do with understanding, reason, knowledge, and absolutely nothing to do with the extent of knowing the general performance capacity related to the intellect. The intelligence quotient, IQ, is therefore not a parameter determined by an less than intelligence test greater than for the evaluation of intellectual capacity in general, nor is it general or within a certain area given intellect, such as factors of the intelligent compared to the intelligence factor intellect memory. It is correct, however, that the effective intelligent quotient, IQ, corresponds to a parameter determined by an intelligent test, which serves to determine overall cognition or understanding, reason, knowledge, and intellectual capacity. The respective intelligentum test always refers only to the respective facts that are addressed and tested. Consequently, no general overall intelligentum evaluation can be created and scored. This means that if an intellectual intelligentum IQ performance capability is created, then it can only be tested on the specific tested facts quotient according to the facts. But this does not give any statement for an intellectual performance capability. An intelligence quotient, IQ, a parameter determined by an intelligence test, therefore always corresponds only to a specific fact or a limited number of facts, but never to a comprehensive general intellectual core parameter. This clearly and unambiguously states that if an intelligent test yields a high score, such as 130 or 140, it is then only related to a single fact or to a few specific facts, and in this respect indicates a certain level of intelligence. If, however, every other intelligent value is defective or inferior and therefore insufficient, then despite his high IQ, a person is stupid with regard to one or more facts or fields. If there is talk of stupidity, then this results from the fact that man does not consider one fact or several or even many, which says that stupidity is a state of not thinking and not establishing the truth. Thus, the less man thinks, and thereby remains ignorant in this or that thing or things, because he does not consider them and does not fathom them, the stupider he is. Even then, if he reaches high IQ values in one field of knowledge or its several. Consequently, if the person in question is incapable of general thought processes and thought values with regard to an adequate general knowledge and with regard to a healthy way of life and coping with life, then he is stupid as a bean or even stupid as a cross bean in spite of a high IQ. And it makes absolutely no difference whether he is a simple and only everyday educated person or whether he holds a doctorate or a professor title.
We really don't need to talk about this any further, because we have already clarified this in previous conversations.
Just so. But now I would like to bury this topic and talk about what Darwin announced, namely that all life originated from a single-cellular microorganism and developed into all that exists. Sfath taught me, however, also by letting me see the whole of truth on a world developing the first basic life through his research technique, and by letting me learn that not only one single organism of a genus or species is the origin of the enormous diversity of all life on the planet. On Earth, too, life in its millions did not develop from a single tiny cell, but, as Sfath taught me and proved to me, a wide variety of virion particles, as they are actually called, only came into existence in masses while they were still outside the cell. Only then, Sfath taught, when a virion particle can infect a host cell, Should it be called less than virus greater than or less than virus greater than? I will mention this once in such a way, whereby I will first mention in relation to the less than variant greater than what you also explained before. The single variant is nothing else than a single small and highly infectious particle, which is called virus, is lifeless and therefore does not correspond to any form of life, so it has no metabolism. Depending on the type, the virus consists of a certain nucleic acid, which is surrounded by a capsid or protein envelope. A virus has no protective shell or cell membrane, and it lacks some kind of plasma, the name of which I do not remember.
It is a cytoplasm that has a liquid-filled reaction space for metabolic processes inside a cell, so viruses, as you mentioned, do not have a cell membrane as selective entrance and exit for dissolved substances. Furthermore, viruses do not have ribosomes, so they cannot produce proteins, just as they cannot produce.
Thank you, now I remember. It is the ribosomes that the viruses lack, and therefore they cannot generate proteins, because they also do not have mitochondria, which produce the energy and forces that the ribosomes need to produce proteins. Furthermore, viruses cannot reproduce themselves, because they can only do so if they have cells from another living being at their disposal that they can infect, which they do as soon as they have infected a host cell. This host cell is then quickly transformed into a mass conversion cell and forced to start a rapid reproduction of the virus and to produce new virus particles in an unstoppable way. Then, please correct me if I should say something wrong, humans, animals, plants, fungi and microorganisms consisting of only a single cell can serve as hosts for viruses. However, most viruses specifically infect only certain cell types. But what viruses consist of at all, that is probably not known to the normal citizens of the earth, which is why perhaps something should be said about it another time and again, just what these things causing various illnesses are all about, just those in which it is actually the case, while nothing needs to be said about the others, which cause good things.
So another time and repeatedly the following is to be explained. Viruses do not consist of one or more cells, because as non-living beings they have no cells at all. Viruses are infectious organic structures, and these spread outside of cells as virions, and this is done by infecting cells, but this is only possible inside of host cells suitable for the viruses. The main purpose of viruses is to spread by infecting fresh host cells. Viruses as nucleic acids are surrounded by a protein envelope, which contains, among other things, the information for controlling the metabolism of a host cell, as well as the genetic material and the information for replication of the viral nucleic acid and for the production of a new virion. When cells are attacked by viruses, they can no longer perform their normal tasks as production sites of constantly newly emerging viruses. In addition, many cells are destroyed when viruses are released, and symptoms of disease become apparent in the organism when the cells are infected by viruses and they begin to act. The viruses carry certain molecules on their envelope that help them to bind to and infect cells. Once the viruses have entered cells, the envelope dissolves and the genetic material enters the cytoplasm of the cells. The nucleic acid is introduced into the cell nuclei and incorporated into the DNA of the host cells. The replication, transcription and translation of the incorporated DNA is performed by the corresponding structures of the host cells. And because the nucleic acid of the viruses contains all the necessary information for the construction of new virions, the host cells automatically produce new virus particles, which are released from the cell and infect further cells, thus starting a constantly new cycle. The main effect of a virion or a virus particle is to spread and thus infect fresh host cells. A virion does not correspond to any form of life and therefore cannot be killed. Depending on the type of virus, it merely consists of certain nucleic acids surrounded by a protein envelope, whereby the type of virus determines its nucleic acid, which can be given as deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, or ribonucleic acid, Na. Each type of nucleic acid, however, contains, in addition to its own information, also information that serves to control the metabolism of the host cell it affects, so that it is aligned with the virus information and causes disease and disaster. In addition to this, a virus is equipped in such a way that, because it contains a corresponding genetic material, it contains information for the replication of its own viral nucleic acid, thus making it capable of producing a new virion and, consequently, it can multiply and spread further until there is a possibility of stopping it, which, however, is only possible through appropriate medication and a corresponding combat and defense reaction of the infected cell. Many common infectious diseases are caused by viruses. Viruses attack the cells of living beings and use them as hosts, in which they first duplicate themselves with the help of the cell, and consequently only in this way new viruses can be produced. Usually, viruses destroy the cells, and if this happens in a body, it can lead to long-lasting diseases and dangerous epidemics and even death. This is of no importance for the viruses, because as non-living beings they continue to exist by multiplying themselves as a result of the duplication by the host cell, and this for as long as they can infect further host cells in time to ensure their own continued existence. On the envelope of the virion, certain molecules arrange themselves, enabling it to bind to cells, after which the interaction leads to the absorption of the virion into the cell. Once this has taken place, the envelope or capsid dissolves, after which the genetic material DNA or enters the cytoplasm of the cell. In this way, the nucleic acid penetrates into the cell nucleus and the DNA is incorporated into the host cell. Afterwards, the replication, transcription and translation of the incorporated DNA takes place through the corresponding structures of the host cell. And because the nucleic acid of the virus contains all necessary information for the new production of virions, new virus particles are automatically produced by the host cell. Consequently, these new virions are then released from the cell, which leads to the cycle of unstoppable further infection of the cells. As a result, the cells can no longer perform their normal tasks and are therefore largely destroyed. For repetition and more detailed explanation, as well as for understanding the whole, I will repeat everything again as follows. Viruses, looked at closely, consist of dust-like substances and are tiny infectious particles, which, in contrast to bacteria, parasites, microorganisms and plants, animals, creatures or insects etc., are not living creatures. Therefore they have no metabolism and are not able to multiply and certainly not to reproduce without the help of a foreign cell. This is because the viruses are not living beings and therefore cannot perform an act of copulation or give birth in any way, but can only multiply under the influence of the host cell. As non-living beings, viruses have no metabolism. They lack a cytoplasm, a liquid-filled reaction space, which is existentially important for life forms and is responsible for the metabolic processes inside the cell. Viruses also lack a cell membrane as a protective shell and selective less than entrance and exit greater than to let dissolved substances in or out. In addition, viruses do not have ribosomes or protein production, nor do they have mitochondria, which would generate energies and forces. And because the viruses themselves cannot produce proteins, they are not able to use energy for themselves and replicate. In order to be able to replicate or multiply, viruses need cells from another living being, so-called host cells, to which they can dock and infect them. As soon as a virus has infected such a cell, it is reprogrammed, stimulated to produce and misused to multiply the virus or to produce new virus particles. As soon as cells are attacked by a virus, they are called host cells, regardless of whether the cell attack occurs in a human or animal, in plants, fungi and even in microorganisms that consist of only a single cell. Any cell of any kind can serve as a host for viruses, but most viruses specifically infect only certain cell types. Viruses were the actual origin of all life, which also makes it clear that the approximately 2.8 million viruses known to us pelagians on Earth not only have negative, dangerous and life-destroying impacts, but also positive, benign and life-creating as well as life-supporting ones.
What I want to ask now, however, refers to what we have recently talked about from our first time here in the center, also with regard to the communication room and the machinery apparatus planned at that time with regard to healthcare etc., whereby I have forgotten the name for it. Somehow, in the meantime, in our kitchen, the word rejuvenation has come up again and again, and the term rejuvenation has been mentioned. The reason for this was my travels into the past and future, which often took a long time.
Translated into the German language, you can call the apparatus that was intended for the intended communication space hydrodynamics regeneration converter.
Exactly. I mean this device, with which the body aging process is regulated and also inhibited and even prevented, and the human being can remain mobile and vital until old age, because the cells etc. maintain their developmental biological state at the time of the treatment or regeneration process, and consequently no aging process takes place. As your father's Foth explained to me, the developmental state of the entire physical body, and thus also of all organs, remains constant over several years, and consequently no aging process takes place. Perhaps you can explain something about this, whereby I think that on the one hand some explanations regarding the aging of the human species could be useful to understand that life can be prolonged by suitable means, but that dying cannot be prevented in the end. Also it might be interesting, what we never talked openly about, that you players only live to be over 1,000 years old, because you use a regeneration converter, while your normal aging is limited. The whole of our conversations came about because I was on the road so often and for many years with Sfath, Asket and Semyaz, as well as with Quetzal and you in past times, but had to use the regeneration converter every now and then. That's how I always stayed fit, and even today I owe my mobility to these devices. Often our conversations went to the point that all those earthlings are wrong about time, who scientifically deal with the times of the past and the future as wanna be knowledgeable and effectively fantasize about a horrendous idle speed. This is because in the past time has to be lived through in the length of time at that time, so that man ages by this already past time, while in the present time, from which one changes into the past, only short minutes or hours pass by a time manipulation. Examples of this are on the one hand the incident and in will, when I, in the presence of witnesses, such as Jacobus and my ex, freshly shaved myself and left the house around midnight, only to be on the road with your daughter Semyaz for about a week in the past, but then came back home 5 hours later after leaving the house at 5 a.m. due to a time manipulation, with a weekly beard spiked in my face. Then,
I know this, because you were together on Crete, because you were interested in the mythological story of the Minotaur and you wanted to know the truth about it.
Because at that time I wanted to get to the bottom of various stories from different mythologies in general, and also about the Minotaur, which is said to have been a man-eating monster half-man half-bull. The Minotaur was a figure from Greek mythology and a creature with a human body but a bull's head. Based on Greek mythology and mythological history, King Minos ruled Crete at that time, who was regarded and worshipped as the son of the god Zeus and the goddess Europa. Minos allegedly asked Poseidon, the sea god who is said to have been his uncle, for a miracle of help to become king of Crete, but also to prevent another king from becoming king. Minos is said to have promised and sworn that he would sacrifice to the sea god for life everything that came out of the sea, including the mermaids, which were already then haunted by mythology, but in reality were not human sea creatures, but seals, which were mistakenly considered human beings by humans, because these mammals in the water could easily be considered human-like. Poseidon, so the saga goes, performed the less than miracle greater than and Minos became king. For Minos to become king, he was to make a sacrifice to the sea god, a magnificent bull, which Minos sent, but which he liked so much that he included it in his own herd of cattle, only to sacrifice an inferior animal instead. But Poseidon is said to have become furious and pissed off and boundlessly angry, and to have taken divine revenge on the sea, allegedly by getting Ptaah, Minotaur's wife, to fall in love with the magnificent bull, which he sent as an offering to Minotaurs. Ptaah, the legend explains, then, as a result of her falling in love, desired the sea divine bull in order to mate with it. And to be able to do this, she had Daedalus, a clever architect, inventor and technician, who according to the legend was a descendant of the god Hephaestus, build a wooden mating frame. Daedalus, alias Daedalus, as he is called in the German language, which I must explain in between, was according to the legend an extremely jealous man who, when his student invented the saw, killed him by throwing him from a high roof into death. Afterwards, according to the legend, he fled to Crete in order not to have to answer to the court in his hometown Athens. On his escape he also took his son Icarus with him. But now back to Ptaah, the wife of King Minotaurs, for whom Daedalus, according to the legend, built a wooden mating frame, which was covered with a cow skin and in which the woman could hide herself in such a way that she was mated by the bull, so that she lay down in the cow mating frame and was impregnated by the bull. So, according to the legend, she did so and was copulated with the bull, and then, at the right time, she gave birth to a son out of this union, who was half man and half bull, or rather the Minotaur, a monster with human form and a bull's head. When King Minotaurs was confronted with all the events of his wife and the bull, Daedalus had to build a labyrinth without an exit, but secretly he considered and built one, of which the king knew nothing. When the labyrinth was finished, the king had the monster locked up in the labyrinth, and he also forbade Daedalus to leave the island. When King Minotaurs one day received the news that his son Eduard had been killed by the fault of King Eduard of Athens, he led a vendetta against Athens and defeated the Athenians, after which he imposed the malicious tribute on them, namely that every 9 years they had to bring 7 youths and 7 virgins to Crete and to the labyrinth of the Minotaur, where they were sent to the labyrinth of the Minotaur and sacrificed to him. In the end, the legend goes on, but the matter was finally brought to an end by Theseus, the son and later successor of Eduard, who took part in the third tribute himself, killing the Minotaur monster. Ariadne, the daughter of King Minotaurs, fell in love with him and helped him with her Ariadne's thread, which he laid out in the labyrinth, and with the help of the thread found the way through the labyrinth in which the Minotaur lived. There are other versions of this, but I don't want to talk about this, only about the legend that Theseus defeated the Minotaur, killed him, and with the help of the thread he laid out Ariadne found his way out of the labyrinth with the youths and virgins. King Minotaurs finally had Daedalus and his son Icarus locked up in the labyrinth as punishment, because it was said that it was he who unrolled the thread from the entrance into the labyrinth, so that the Avenger could find Theseus again. Daedalus, the builder of the labyrinth, knew the exit and fled, after he had built wings for himself and his son Icarus to use them to escape from the island. Together with Icarus, Daedalus climbed up a high rock near the sea, where both of them put on their prefabricated wings, and Daedalus told his son not to climb too high into the sky, because otherwise the sun would melt the wax with which the feathers were attached to the wings. He also told him not to fly too low, because the spray of the sea would soak his wings and he could fall. When the two then flew off, so the legend reports, the two were quickly over the open sea, whereby Icarus enjoyed flying recklessly and high-spiritedly in such a way that he climbed higher and higher into the sky. Thus it happened what his father had warned him about. When he came too close to the blazing sun, the wax melted and the wings lost their feathers, so Icarus fell into the sea and drowned. The island on which his washed-up body was later found, according to the legend, was then named less than a caria greater than in his honor. Daedalus mourned his son very much, but he arrived safely in Sicily, where he was welcomed by King Kokkilos, who later protected him from King Minotaurs, who wanted to bring him back, when he escaped after the matter concerning the wooden mating frame and the thread laid out in the labyrinth, but after which Daedalus lived for a long time and as a technician made many great inventions. Today, he is considered the ancestor of all sculptors, because he is said to have created the first large statues, which is not true, however, because I have seen larger sculptures much earlier, during journeys into the past that led back to the Neanderthals about 50,000 years ago. but Daedalus is also regarded as the ancestor of the technicians, also erroneously, because I have seen it myself, that already more than 6,800 years ago in the southern flat areas of the Danube and up to the hilly foothills of the Bavarian alpine regions there lived people who had developed technical skills and laboriously cut thick slices from massive tree trunks, which were shaped like wheels and had a hole in the middle. A straight, thick branch was pushed through this hole and then used as a kind of mill wheel for grinding grain, nuts, etc. into flour. Later on, during a stay in the past about 3,600 years ago, I saw the Sumerians in Mesopotamia chiseling wheels out of large thick stones with centered holes, which they provided with thick axles and used to move carts. But what made me want to go back to Minoan times was to find out how, why and from what the Minotaur legend was born. The reality was that the Minotaur legend was created almost 3 centuries after the death of King Minos and was based on something that had nothing to do with the belief in the sea god Poseidon. The effective fact was that, as your daughter Semyaz and I undoubtedly learned and found out in the places of the events of that time, Pasiphae, the wife of King Minos, was impregnated by him and then gave birth to a son who was physically disfigured, similar to the less-than-elephant man greater than who lived in England in the last century. A film was also made of this man at that time, which I have seen, and he was also shamefully and irresponsibly misused effectively as a money-making sensational showpiece, whereby various scoundrels were able to enrich themselves with his misery. I think you can certainly find a lot about this on the internet, at least a description of the person, his name and his story. Maybe a photo can be found as well, so I will have a look. If I should find the picture, I will add it to our conversation, but if possible also a description.
Wikipedia. Joseph Carey Merrick, August 5, 1862 in Leicester. Dagger April 11, 1890 in London, became known as the Elephant Man during the Victorian era. Merrick suffered from severe deformations of his body, which completely disfigured his shape and face. In the Victorian era he was considered the worst example of the pathological deformation of the human face. Since his childhood John Merrick was terribly disfigured. As an elephant man, he was paraded at fairs and tormented by his sadistic owner until finally the Dr. Frederick Treves discovered him and offered to help him. England in the late 19th century. The elephant man John Merrick suffers from severe physical deformities since childhood, especially his head and upper body are severely deformed. He is exhibited by sadistic and exploitative showmen at fairs as a rare curiosity and is gawped at by the sensation-seeking public. But then the surgeon Frederick Treves becomes aware of his case and takes it with him to London to examine it there and give it a decent home in the hospital. After initial skepticism, the staff there finally agrees, when it becomes clear that the elephant man has a sensitive and intelligent character. But despite the fruitful efforts of the doctor to introduce John Merrick into society, he is not safe from human cruelty. Life of the elephant man Merrick's deformities were not recognizable at birth, but began to develop from the age of 21 months and to become more severe from the age of 5. At first he attended a normal school. When his mother Mary Jane Merrick died of pneumonia on May 19, 1873, she left Joseph and his 2 younger siblings William Arthur and Marian Eliza. His father changed his place of residence and soon afterwards married his landlady, who brought her own children into the marriage and had little sympathy for Joseph. She forced her husband to push Joseph out of the family environment. With the help of his uncle Charles Merrick, Joseph initially found work at Messrs. Freeman's cigar manufacturers, but soon had to give it up because his right hand had become too heavy and misshapen for cigar making. After a few unprofitable attempts as a street vendor, Merrick went to fairs as a monster with the participation of Tom Norman. In November 1886 Joseph Merrick was in London, where he caught the attention of the surgeon Frederick Treves, who examined him and wrote a report using the name John Merrick for Merrick, which was later published in the British Medical Journal. As the expositions were repeatedly banned by the authorities, Merrick travelled to Belgium with his manager, from where he returned of his own accord in December 1886. On arrival in London, he was robbed of his savings of £50, equivalent to the purchasing power of about €6,000 in 2007. The only salvation in this desperate situation was a business card from Treves, whom he sought help from. Treves granted him admission to London Hospital. Merrick's stay was later financed by the Joseph Merrick Fund, which was provided by donations from readers of the London Times. Treves describes Merrick as an intelligent, albeit childishly naive person with a pleasant character. His speech, however, was so impaired by his deformity that few people who had regular contact with him were able to understand him. Merrick died unexpectedly on April 11, 1890, in good physical condition in the morning and found dead on his bed in the afternoon. It is assumed that he suffered a stroke or a mild heart attack that brought him down. Death was then caused by suffocation. Joseph Merrick could only sleep squatting due to scoliosis, hunchback and lateral spinal curvature. On the day of his death, however, Joseph Merrick was found lying on his back in his bed, which he had normally always avoided. His deformity otherwise meant that there was a danger that his rather heavy head would sink backwards into the sleeping pad, thereby overstretching the windpipe and pulling the trigger. And exactly this was probably the cause of his death. Whether intentionally or unintentionally caused, there is no answer. Occasionally the assumption was expressed that Merrick was Jack the Ripper. However, this assumption is completely unfounded. Merrick suffered from severe movement restrictions due to his deformities, and he could not hold an object in his right hand. With the given limitations, he would have had difficulty and more time to perform the rather fine motor actions performed on the killed people. Moreover, he would have attracted too much attention through his movements and his appearance. Reasons for the deformation: Merrick suffered from a genetic disorder that not only caused enormous changes in the skin, but also buoyed up the bones. Thus, at a height of 157 centimeters, the head circumference 91 centimeters, arms and legs were oversized, only the left hand was not affected by the disease. During Merrick's lifetime, doctors assumed that he suffered from elephantiasis. In 1971, Ashley Montague assumed that it might have been the hereditary disease neurofibromatosis, Recklinghausen disease. In 1979, Michael Cohen discovered the rare Ptaah syndrome, which was identified as the cause of Merrick's deformities in 1986. In contrast to Recklinghausen's disease, Ptaah syndrome does not affect nerve cells but tissue cells. A DNA analysis of Merrick's bones and hair in July 2003 confirmed that he did indeed suffer from Ptaah syndrome. However, additional evidence of Recklinghausen disease was also found. Some experts still doubt the previous findings on the causes of Joseph Merrick's disease, especially with regard to the thesis that it is Ptaah syndrome. Michael Simpson, geneticist at Guy's Hospital in London, is currently, 2013, preparing to study Joseph Merrick's genome and is certain that at least one major cause of the physical deformities is due to a single, non-inherited mutation. The current goal of his preparations is to study the AKT1 gene on chromosome 14. This gene regulates growth in healthy people and is involved in apoptosis, that is programmed cell death. If this gene does not function or does not function properly, this function is no longer performed and the observed tissue growths occur. According to Michael Simpson, it should now be technically possible to provide genetic proof of the Ptaah syndrome thesis. Until now, the problem has been that valuable tissue samples were lost during the Second World War, and since the death of Joseph Merrick in 1890. The skeleton has simply been subjected too often and too intensively to the most diverse cleaning processes. Simpson suspects that Joseph Merrick is one of the rare individual cases of a disease. Simpson has been able to identify 20 of such individual cases in the past 3 years. All of these 20 cases were point mutations.
Like Joseph Carey Merrick, the so-called less than elephant man greater than The second son of King Minos and his wife Pasiphae was also severely deformed physically and showed a certain resemblance to a bull's head, as well as his shape, and therefore also his face was completely disfigured. And as it was then, and as it is still the case today, the boy was rejected by his parents due to his already congenital physical deformation. Usually at that time, handicapped children were killed after birth, but Minotaurs, as he was called, did not kill them. This was because a king and his wife feared that the sea god had brought about the whole of the physical deformation as a punishment, because they had spread evil insults against him. Therefore they were afraid that Poseidon would take renewed and even worse revenge on them if the son, who was physically deformed by his power, was killed. So it was decided by Minos and Pasiphae that a court servant, a Ptaah or so was her name, would take care of the son and raise him, namely far away in the white country. Minotaurs had a good intelligence, was very peaceful in nature, and was surprisingly well educated by the court servants, so that one could talk to him via translator. When he was grown up and his governess told him about his origins, he tried to enter the court and demand his rights, but the king and his wife reacted maliciously and ordered Daedalus to build a labyrinth, which was actually a huge cave, to imprison the physically deformed son. However, always fearing the revenge of Poseidon, they tried to appease the sea god, and they did so by arranging for human sacrifices to be regularly made in the labyrinth, but only young people of both sexes, who were first chosen from the population, robbed and killed as victims, but later by Athens, after war had been waged there and the Minotaurs had won. What finally has to be mentioned in regard to the whole thing is that due to the sacrifice of young people for appeasement and fear of revenge of the god Poseidon, the lie has arisen. Poseidon, who due to his deformed face, head and body was imprisoned by his father and mother, was called Minotaur, was a man-eater, and therefore the human sacrifices offered for Poseidon would also serve as food for him. Then I come back to what happened in Ondir, when my girlfriend freaked out when I, infected with zinc fever, was with her in the hotel, had just shaved and she went out to do some shopping, whereupon Uranus Aska took me away to travel in the past for 11 months, during which time I grew a nice beard. Then Aska, through a time manipulation, took me back to the hotel room about half an hour after I left, like the one I had left. After which my girlfriend got upset, because she thought I was trying to annoy her by sticking a full beard on my face that she was going to tear off. When she then noticed that the beard was real, she went crazy and of course couldn't understand anything anymore, because I wasn't allowed to explain anything to her. Her mind was simply overwhelmed, which is why the danger of going crazy came up, which is why Asked intervened and erased what she had experienced from her memory. But there were several other similar incidents where it was noticed that after short absences I suddenly had longer stubble on my face again, but these findings were usually mild, because the people watching me knew what was going on. Well, also in other ways than with time scientists tell nonsense or fantasize about it, also in relation to astronomy, because the whole science of astronomy has no idea how and what the universe is in reality. So they also do not know that everything visible from the Earth, in total everything of the stars, etc., corresponds to only 1/7 of the space-time structure universe, just as this space-time structure universe also constitutes only 1/7 of the entire space of creation, which has a lifetime, starting from the so-called Big Bang until the end of the final contraction, of 311 trillion Earth years. Nor do they have any idea of how the real universal laws and the laws of creation behave, nor of how the dimensions and all the trimmings of creation come into being and behave, and that everything is quite different from what is assumed or claimed. And that the creation is illusionally called God and Godfather, Allah, Theos, Parameshvar, Shiva, Choda, Shaner Kami etc. This corresponds to nothing else than a pathologically erroneous imagination that is endlessly far from any truth.
This is indeed the case in regard to what you have explained. And what you have mentioned concerning the developmental biological state of the cell, this is also correct. The basic biological discipline of the human species is the same as biogerontology, but to explain it in more detail, in terms of aging science, would be like a scientific study of human life in old age and aging. It would be pointless to explain it in detail, so I will only briefly answer your question as follows. Aging corresponds to a factor that is progressive and in no way reversible, and therefore not such that discipleship can occur. In humans, as in the majority of all other life forms, the biological process is regulated according to the law of creation in such a way that their organism is composed of several cells. Consequently, a gradual change results from aging, namely a loss of energy and strength as well as a suffering of the healthy body and the organ functions. The gradual loss of energy and strength of the whole organism, as well as suffering and diseases, eventually lead to biological death. In relation to various diseases, aging causes major health risk factors, such as cancer, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney failure and Parkinson's disease, coronary heart disease and accidents, etc. This results in a maximum lifespan that cannot be predicted and achieved in advance, thus limiting aging by all these factors. Aging as a physiological process corresponds to an elementary life process, which is inherent to all higher forms of life and represents a biological phenomenon, which can be positively influenced and prolonged by various measures, but its effectiveness cannot be cancelled or terminated. In general, aging is a process of a number of different highly complex organic processes which influence the whole organism and determine the lifespan of all biological systems such as cells, thus limiting the lifespan of the organs, tissues and organisms built from them. This process of aging can be controlled with suitable, however, maximum limits are also set in this respect, so that organ regeneration cannot take place endlessly, because when a certain state is reached through natural aging of the organs, they become susceptible to aging and fail inexorably. And this brings me to the explanation regarding our age limit, which is normally not 1,000, 1,200 or 1,400 years or more, because our plecaric lifespan, calculated according to earthly years, which differ only slightly from our calendar, is on average 380 years. Furthermore, with regard to the age and aging of our Plerian humanity, it must be said that many people do not try to prolong their lives and therefore do not use any of the hydrodynamic regeneration converters available to everyone, but live through their lifetime normally and die just as normally when they have become tired of life. Suicides are absolutely unknown to us, as well as diseases. Only on Earth could health problems occur with us until the 1980s with regard to rhinitis, which is no longer the case since 1983. Other people of our humanity use the regeneration apparatuses to live on for some years, decades or centuries, especially when very long and over many centuries lasting commitments are made and exercised. However, it rarely happens that the aim is to live beyond 1,500 years, because inevitably, over time, life fatigue or the natural aging process occurs, so that dying naturally becomes the end of life.
Thank you. That was certainly once necessary to explain. But look here at this newspaper note. Alexei Anatolovich Navalny, whom we spoke about the other day, was obviously really poisoned. He is a Russian lawyer and an oppositional dissident and politician who calls himself democratic. Since about 2009 he has been making a name for himself, but in my opinion not in a democratic way, but as a radical who is out for violence.
I know this, and what you say is true, because this man is devious, malicious and geared towards violence and pathologically towards power, as I have noticed. If he were to come to power, he could only be expected to exercise power, as is the case with all those power-hungry people in government, organizations, families, the military, the workplace and anywhere else where they can exercise their lust for power with the help of their simple-minded, intelligence-impaired advocates. And this man.
You astonish me, my friend, because lately you have been tending more and more towards idioms that actually belong in my inventive vocabulary.
As you always say, it just rubs off. Besides, I just realized that our conversation today is taking shape with regard to the earthly human inadequacies and is leading to statements for which I, too, will have to use your vocabulary to clarify some things that can neither be said nor expressed correctly with gentle and diplomatic phrases and words.
Just so. But what I want to say about Navalny, coming back to Navalny, is that I have already seen enough of his face in newspapers and on TV shows and have got a very bad and even the impression that this man is completely unscrupulous and malicious and capable of everything that the devil and the Beelzebubin have to offer. His physiognomy expresses something very malicious and devious, which gives rise to the thought that, in order to make Putin guilty and to finish him off, he might have arranged everything himself and might have miscalculated something. But this is effectively only a conjecture, as well as the possibility that he could have been driven by one of the US Secret Services to his private war against Putin and paid for it, while on the other hand there's also the possibility that he was actually pinched by some Russian people, such as Putin's enemies, separatists or other corrupt figures with less than something greater than Novikok. That Putin is behind this, however, I dare to doubt for various reasons, as well as because his intelligence is to be rated much higher than that of Navalny, who seems to me like a crazy snot boy, who is obviously driven by stupidity, hatred, public horniness and power politics. Most of the rulers are acting out and misgoverning their desires for power, while good people are demonized by violent oppositionalists, like Navalny, who attacks Putin and wants to force him out of office. Such earthlings want to take the rudder into their own hands and then create disorder in the country and demolish everything good, which is obviously what Navalny is also planning. He wants to change and demolish everything that Putin has built up in Russia and has also created order in the country. I also think that the whole world should actually be glad and grateful that Putin is at the top in Russia, because he knows how to parry the poisonous attacks of the EU dictatorship and the USA and all the other blind fools. This in particular regarding the cross-bean-straw stupid state powers of the USA, the EU dictatorship, Germany and other countries, to which unfortunately also certain elements of Switzerland belong, which are besides willing to betray the homeland and to barter into the EU dictatorship. All of them are sick in the head and have no idea that they are lucky that in Russia Putin is the supreme intelligent leader, that he stoically parries all attacks and thereby prevents another great or even world war, which the power leadership idiots of the USA have been striving for again for a long time. And this is what the USA is doing, as they have been doing since time immemorial and are criminally accustomed to interfere in the affairs of other countries worldwide, to create discord, to chase their military killers into all countries, and to bring more and more states under their bloody control. But the stupidest among all the stupid do not recognize and understand this, because their intelligence is not sufficient for it. And unfortunately we have such elements in Switzerland, too, who hang on the malodorous buttocks of the fallible and pathological greed for power in the US government, but in the same way also in Switzerland too, and try everything to drive our country into the dirty EU dictatorship and to integrate it into it, whereby such cross, dumb, stupid and treasonous elements of dirt are not only to be found in the population and in EU dictatorship-friendly parties, but also in the National Council, Council of States and Federal Council. This, what the righteous, loyal to Switzerland and to our good, peaceful and neutral homeland are suppressed in their state offices by the lies, slander and misrepresentations of the traitors of both sexes in such a way that they are not able to resist. This is especially true because the liars in their official positions of power with their truth-deplaguing misrepresentations and false information also deceive the voters and make them cast their votes according to the lies and misrepresentations in favor of the EU dictatorship supporters, etc. Unfortunately, it is the same in Switzerland, and I want to mention this explicitly, because I know that many will insult my openness with curses and disgrace. Because on the one hand they are too cowardly to think through the effective facts themselves in a precise and logical way, so that they are not able to find, recognize or understand reality and truth. On the other hand, precisely because of their cowardly unthinking, they are beaten by stupidity and are thereby faithfully forfeited to all those who create lying and political views of lies and slander, which they maliciously direct against other persons and states in which they interfere, although all things of which they have no business at all. All these are the ones who again and again get involved in foreign countries, their politics and interfere in foreign countries and form crazy opinions about other peoples and states, although they have neither a healthy knowledge of human nature nor of the state and population relations, the corresponding mentality and everything else necessary for an effectively correct assessment of the facts and situation, etc. Know the facts. Condemnations are immediately released, enmity and terror are created, while the fallible ones, who are usually in the highest positions of governments and religious leaderships, as well as in the media, are the ones who cause terror and evil, who incite the population with insulting insults against other people and countries and who provoke hatred. And it is then the unthinking majority of the populations, and likewise not seeking the effective truth, that howls and roars with hatred and contempt for humanity against those who are incited to hatred, and in the end goes out with weapons, and even warlike against the others, who are confounded by those who are incited to hatred. But the fact that the effectively fallible, those who are in the highest positions in governments and religions, in organizations, sects, associations, in families and family clans, in simple groups and or in authorities, etc., have neither good and healthy psychological abilities and knowledge, because they have not learned anything in this regard. They lack any knowledge of human nature, as well as any effective ability to judge people, their behavior, and in every respect also the flair to judge and determine something correctly and exactly. But this is exactly the point, which should be demanded particularly with humans, and should be obligation for any leading positions, in governments as well as in religions, circles, schools, organizations, sects, associations, in families and family clans, in simple groups and or in authorities, etc. Such responsible positions may only be filled by persons who must be effectively trained in the mentioned relation, also concerning the ability to judge logically and consequently and correctly an arising thing, an event, a necessity or a situation, etc. fast and efficiently and act accordingly. But exactly these necessary abilities are usually lacking for the majority of all leaders of the state, as well as for leaders, superiors, representatives of religions, authorities, organizations, sects, associations, families and family clans and groups of all kinds, etc., which leads to unrest, uprisings, war and terror in all countries of the world, as well as to dissatisfaction, hatred and all kinds of possible evils. And the lack of all these skills, which are urgently needed to be learned, has its effects above all on the highest rulers of all the states of the world, with all the highest rulers of the USA in the forefront, as in Europe those of the EU dictatorship as well as those of the Federal Republic of Germany, to which it must unfortunately be added that the majority of the populations of these states are equally uneducated, clueless, unthinking and therefore stupid with regard to the same skills, and therefore choose the greatest asses as their leaders. Non-thinking and therefore stupidity, as is well known, knows no bounds, is endless and does not promote any abilities in any good, correct and progressive positive way. It is like everywhere else in the world that if someone tells the truth, especially a believer in God's delusion and a party loser like me, he is then all around decried as a troublemaker, antisocial and criminal, etc., especially by secret services and state protectors, as these less than heroes call themselves, who demonstrably denigrated me with lies and slander even in their ficas. They colored the names of informers in black, but wrote the ficas so stupidly that even the last fool in world history could read out who the informers were. And this is truly the best example of how great the intelligence of certain people is, who are paid with tax money from the Swiss and other people, who on the one hand are simple-minded and on the other hand brazenly spy on their own countrymen and are too stupid to get to the bottom of the effective truth. And all this corresponds effectively to an intelligent poverty testimony, if such less than spy experts, who should work for the security of the country, but who let themselves be lulled by lies and slander of malicious informers and, moreover, take every crap and nonsense told to them at face value and believe it without verification. This, just as they as believers usually believe the nonsense that a certain imaginary less than Lord God greater than created the universe and everything up to the last flea and virus and is responsible that everything functions according to his given correctness and love. But it must be asked where in these creatures their religious and supposedly God-conditioned correctness and love can be found, in them who believe, as is also the case with the majority of mankind. For, when I look at these figures, then they are no different from the overgrown overpopulation. All around, I see only hypocritical, lying faith in God, alleged observance of alleged commandments of God, and love of neighbor, whereby all these effectively only hypocritical observances of God's law correspond to nothing else but self-deception and self-deception. And this is exactly what has been proven again and again since time immemorial, because the overgrown of the entire God-believing humanity on earth instinctively reacts in a flash in every conceivable malicious, hostile and violent way as soon as something arises that gets on his nerves, or even just against his own view or opinion. If such a thing arises, then the entire delusional belief in God is forgotten in a flash, and consequently, God's commanded love, love of neighbor, and righteousness, all that is peaceful, freedom of opinion, all that is good, friendly, liberal, all decency, protection of all life, as well as all honor and dignity, are only noise and smoke. In a flash, namely, only wrathful reactions are made, either with malicious insults, or with lies and slander. Then, however, when it goes on and rage arises, everything immediately degenerates with massive fisticuffs, with mad acts of violence up to murder and manslaughter, war and terror. And this arises abruptly as soon as something is said or done that is contrary to what is in accordance with one's own opinion and view, and which is above all directed against one's own delusional belief in God. And exactly this belief in the Lord God, who supposedly rules in love and encourages his flock to love, is then simply misused, trampled underfoot and used to harass the neighbor, to hurl bad words and insults at him, even to do violence to him without hesitation, freely according to the delusional belief in God, to wage war in the name of the Lord and with his blessing, which, however, corresponds to nothing other than the less than will you not be my brother or sister, then I will smash your skull greater than. The fact is that among the believers in the delusion of God everything hidden and everything malicious and degenerate immediately breaks through what is buried in their lowest character ground and veigles out when they think they are under attack. Everything comes immediately and uncontrollably to the outbreak and rampage, all evil, falsehood and violence, all discord, war, terror, lies and deceit, as well as murder and manslaughter, hatred, revenge and retribution, greed, rape, pedophile shamefulness, and everything that otherwise suppresses the delusional belief in God, but only until an attack or an opportunity to break out occurs. Then, in a flash, all that is godly disappears and lets all that is malicious break through, and consequently, all supposedly godly thoughts and resolutions for peace, love, righteousness, and charity, etc., vanish in a flash and are forgotten as if they had never been thought. And since this is what I myself have experienced with innumerable people in many countries, including Switzerland, since I have been disparaged by the lies and slanderous ficus of the less than Swiss protectors of the state greater than, I can only say that this is a disgrace for Switzerland. The fact that such espionage top brass are let loose on Swiss citizens who are persistent, hard-working and hold their home country in honor and dignity, and are discriminated against by lies and slander, has even cost human lives when Swiss were executed in the last World War. How I experienced this myself at the Kutzem Sea, when my godfather, who was a prisoner of war in the prison less than Poschwiesen greater than in Regensdorf, crept with me as a boy through the forest to the place of the execution, where we watched the execution. And all this spying, suspecting and discriminating by espionage elements has been going on since the time when this nasty and yet ridiculous force was created at the taxpayers' expense.
I can understand your attacking execution, for I have seen your fishes that you have presented to me. I also know what unpleasant experiences you have made and talked about in this way in many countries all over the world. And the mentioned fishes, which were created as a result of lies and slander against your person, were more than just a disgrace. Just as such behavior towards one's own countrymen is manifested and state-paid elements infiltrate private affairs, so the same is done in practically all countries of the world, in that the leaders of all countries interfere in the affairs of other countries, reprimand them and stupidly and brazenly punish them with sanctions. On the one hand, however, it is not the enemy leaders who are affected, but the people who are innocent and uninvolved in the machinations of their leaders and who suffer under the sanctions of foreign states as well as under the false goings-on and nonsensical actions of their own governments. It is also worth mentioning that in all the states of the world everything is over-organized with regard to all laws, rules, decrees and various regulations, etc. in a completely inconsiderate and stupid way, whereby the populations are kept like a kind of state slaves and are not free. In all earthly countries there is an over-organization with regard to the domination and control of all strata of the population and their existential forms, freedoms, duties, regulations, prohibitions, rights and rules, as a result of which the earthly people have no real freedom but are enslaved, even if they are pretended to have freedom and blindly believe this lie. This fact, as well as the religiously cultivated and maintained delusion of faith, has since time immemorial also promoted discord, violence, xenophobia, racial and ethnic hatred in the majority of terrestrial humanity. And all these malignities also prevail in the majority of all state leaders, security forces and protective powers, so that they stir up attacks, lies, slander, enmity and discord among and against other countries at every possible opportunity, impose sanctions on them and, if possible, ignite wars, whereby endless suffering, misery and mass deaths result from them. On the one hand, the majority of those good-for-nothing leaders must be mentioned in the first place, who, because of their incapacity, should never hold or lead such an office, but who, because of the stupidity of the majority of the people, are nevertheless elected for it and, moreover, are enthusiastically admired and exalted. This despite the fact that they are unfit as leaders and are more harmful and dominous than that in their incapacity and in their consequently incorrect thinking and acting they bring about something good, right, peaceful, progressive and reasonable. But it is precisely these absolutely incapable of their office who, for lack of knowledge of human nature, thought and thoughtfulness, and through inability, and thus as a result of the effective stupidity of the majority of the people, are elected to the state leadership, exalted and frenetically cheered, whereby the cheered are able to carry out their sinister, politically destructive work, create discord in the world, and lead their peoples into misery and misery.
I think we've said enough about that, so I think it's more important to address other things, like what happened with your linguists and scribes, who you said recently complained about my spelling and asked me to be careful in the future to avoid making certain mistakes, because they find it difficult to correct them and to set right everything that I misspelled, because it doesn't match what the conversation notes said. In addition, I would like to know what I am doing wrong, so that I can write it in the right way.
They complain that on the one hand you insert hyphens between different words and terms, which are absurd, as they explain. So it is not only completely wrong and, moreover, a bad habit that you subdivide words, designations, and concepts with hyphens, which do not need such, because the individual values, words, and concepts are independently owned and may not be joined together with hyphens to false unit values. On the other hand, they further complain.
Moment, please, because I do not understand what is meant by this. Could you please give me 2 or 3 examples? Because I should know how I make hyphenation mistakes in the mentioned relationship. Because if I don't know these mistakes, then I stand there like a donkey on a mountain and cannot correct the wrong thing.
Of course, you can only avoid these mistakes if you know what is wrong. Therefore, see these notes that have been given to me concern, among other things, these misrepresentations, fig time signs, fig periodicals, Semjas Silver Star Center, fig members, fig forum and readers questions answer. The explanations to the complaints are explained with the fact that it is in any case a matter of wrong connections, because there is no direct connection between the individual term values, but each term represents an independent value on its own, therefore no joining together by a hyphen is allowed. In this way, for example, the term less than fig greater than is an independent value, which is to be interpreted as less than free community of interest universal greater than, while the term less than forum greater than corresponds to another independent value, which is not directly related to fig, but embodies a completely independent value, which means asynchronous communication, and consequently individual contributions do not occur simultaneously, but rather at different times. A forum serves the exchange of thoughts or a thing as well as the spreading and archiving of realizations, experiences, personal or community views and ideas as well as opinions and knowledge, etc. Therefore the different values are not connected with hyphens, but are to be kept separate.
Aha, I see, but I have been aware of this since my early youth, because your father's fath already taught me this. But the whole thing that comes up concerning the hyphens or hyphens as you say, is not my work, because I did not introduce that to us.
Our scholars also complain, they have a perfect command of your Swiss German dialect and language, as well as of the High German language, that the word order in the transcripts of conversations is often changed from the original text, which we take from your computer, and is misrepresented until the final result, with word shifts obviously occurring in the sentence progressions, resulting in sentence falsifications. These then no longer correspond to your original, but to a false and foreign way of speaking, and consequently a foreign sense of fact results, which, influenced by a foreign factor, no longer corresponds to the meaning of your utterances and statements. Every person has a special style of speaking, by which he or she selects, defines, and pronounces his or her word order, and thereby explains facts in a special and clear way, which, however, are falsified by word shifts. We know that unpleasant external harmful interventions are taking place in your computer again and again, so the reason for these occurrences of word shifts in a sentence is probably the harmful interventions in your computer, which no longer correspond to the actual course of the conversation, but rather to falsifications of the conversation. Unarera and Zafanapanich have been trying for years to find the origin of these interventions in your computer, but they have not been successful in this respect either. It is the task of our scholars of scripture and language to check the recordings of our conversations conducted in your mother tongue, to see whether you have written them correctly in the High German language, from which they translate word for word into our Ptaah language. And this will be done according to the peculiarities of your regionally and socially delimited Swiss German, and a translation of the same into the High German language. However, as our scholars have repeatedly noted and criticized, the conversation reports often no longer correspond to the specific word coinage, the word combination, or the syntactic structure, nor to the overall meaning, which should be deduced from the individual meanings of the words in the course of the sentence. The final font, which we retrieve from your computer, no longer corresponds to the first font, which we also check in order to check the whole content of the whole in order to prevent any incorrect recordings. However, we have never found anything like this, but it always turns out that your computer record does not correspond to the final record, because sometimes such falsifications appear by shifting words to other places in the sentences, which results in completely different sentence values. Sentence values are used according to individual use of meaning, which, however, is falsified by word shifts, and because this is the case in the final print of the conversation reports, our scholars are laboriously busy restoring the original version in the correct way. Unfortunately, Zafanapanich and Unarera, despite many efforts, have not yet been able to show any results in their efforts to understand the technology used to cause damage in the typing on your computer.
Unfortunately, there are things between heaven and earth. But that would be going too far, so I'd better ask about Jack the Ripper again, because even today this killer does not leave certain people alone, so that even today, after more than 140 years, they are still under the delusion that they have to find the less than true greater than killer, but who was caught and executed. Since the events of that time, it must have been 1888 or so, if I remember correctly, about 80 suspects have been linked by professional simplers and other know-it-alls and great researchers, etc. to the crimes of Jack the Ripper, who murdered and mutilated 5 prostitutes in London. Now clever British researchers from Liverpool and Leeds believe that they finally know the true identity of the London serial killer and that they actually know his identity, thanks to a DNA trace they claim to have found. A certain Dr. Jerry Luhalainen, as well as David Miller, who are supposed to be scientists, have been investigating a scarf that belonged to one of the victims, who was supposed to have been murdered by Jack the Ripper in 1888. This is what the research magazine Less Than Journal of Forensic Sciences Greater Than writes. The 2 researchers claim this because they attribute the DNA trace to an immigrant from Poland, a hairdresser named Aaron Kosminski, who was living in London at the time. This was already traded by Scotland Yard before approximately 130 years as one of the main suspects. Even hobby detectives have had this suspicion for a long time, but until today it has never been possible to prove that he or any of the other suspects was actually the Ripper, and consequently the crimes they were accused of could never be proven and no real culprit could ever be found. Who really committed the murders and who Jack the Ripper really was has been the subject of many new investigations, fantasy and sham investigations and many theories in world history since 1888. In the 1940s, for example, the last suspect died, while the latest suspect must have been Aaron Kosminski, who was supposedly Jack the Ripper and was insane, and was therefore admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1890 and died there 29 years later, in 1919. And the Jack the Ripper, which was effectively called Drive Thomas Neil Kareem, that is absolutely and irrevocably certain? I don't doubt your words, because it is only a rhetorical question.
It is answered.
Of course. Then the following: instead of a religious delusion, Earthlings should think about the reality of reality and its truth and turn to it, learn to think for themselves rather than being preached all kinds of impossible nonsense by priests, clergy and other sectarians, to believe and follow without hesitation. The Earthlings should finally understand and really understand that they should free themselves from all believing madness and use even their brain and consciousness for thinking, reasoning and recognizing the truth as well as for self-decision of all things and in every respect for action. How stupid and foolish then must a man be if he does not understand this and does not realize that everything and everything, every thought and every feeling, every action and everything is not at all determined by an imaginary God, as the clergy, preachers, and sectarians, etc., fantasize and lie about it, in order to lull men into a crazy faith and make them unfree and dependent on a delusional belief. And this dependence and unfreedom also serve to make all dependent and unfree men, who are addicted to delusional faith, shut their mouths and follow their lead also to everything and everyone, when they are harassed, exploited, and more restricted in their personal freedom by government orders. But delusion hides all this, and that is also that both religions and state structures work together and together keep the people under a control that restricts their freedom, so that they do not dare to flinch, even when they realize and feel that they are oppressed, cheated and exploited. Religions and sects do not want any independently thinking people, especially believers in hearing, unbelievers and knee-jerkers, who are enslaved and let themselves be held down and exploited by a delusional belief, financially, as well as often heterosexual, homosexual, masochistic, sadistic and pedophile. Digital sectarianism of all kinds contributes to this to a very large extent, whereby their sermons and other lie stories serve only to catch the faithful. Everything is aimed at innocent and not self-thinking people, whereby whole states are dominated solely by the delusional belief in God of religions and sects, and indoctrinately transformed into enemies of other people, because these other people are delusional in God. In this way the peoples of the earth are dominated by delusional belief, commit murder for their delusional belief, and practice terror, hatred, revenge, and retribution to the point of death, in delusional belief, for which they are allowed to squat in heaven at the feet of their imaginary god and kiss his foul-smelling fins. That, dear friend, is what I wanted to say today, because on various occasions various sectarians have again harassed me by telephone in the middle of the night with their slimy attempts at conversion, even in the early hours of the morning from the USA.
There is probably no comment to be made about this, because you obviously only wanted to say once how persistent and penetrating the whole blasphemy of religious and sectarian mendacity is.
Right, it just had to come out again. But now I have a few things we should discuss together privately, if you still have time?
Of course, but you need sleep.
It still works.
If you say so.
Yes, I think so. Well then,